Okay, today we have Niels as our speaker. Some of you might know him.
Sorry, Pedro's, this is Pedro's last day. Is Pedro here?
No, Pedro is not.
Pedro's not here. And Marcus got his PhD. Marcus is not here because he's officially been awarded his PhD. So when you see him, give him a hug.
Okay, some of you might know Niels, some not. Niels has joined us from December from University of Leuven, Belgium, and he will stay with us for 6 months. So Niels has a background in computer science and architecture, and is currently pursuing a PhD that investigates the social and architectural qualities of media architecture. So I assume that his presentation today is something related to his PhD, so we're so interested and excited to hear about that. Please join me welcoming Niels. Thank you.
So thanks for the introduction, and also thank you for attending. Just one thing that I want to make clear, I'm an architect and a software engineer, but not to be confused with a software architect, because that's a question I often get. So are you a software architect? No, I'm a building architect, or whatever you call that, and I'm a software engineer. So indeed, in this talk, I will focus on the work that I've been doing in Belgium prior to my time in Melbourne, which focuses on media architecture and investigating how we can push it forward from a technological gadget, which it still is nowadays, to a more placemaking and social medium. Since I'm new here, since Belgium is pretty much unknown, I guess, in this part of the world, let me quickly introduce where I'm coming from and the research group I'm coming from. We are a relatively young group called Research X Design, and since we are so young, we still have no logos. So we typically simply show off our office location, which is in this heritage-listed castle near Leuven, Belgium. And even though this is historical, our research is very much contemporary and technological. So what we do is really investigate the role and the use of technology in public space. Yeah, well, that's actually a very big discussion going on right now. So that's EMEC, which is a spin-off developing transistors and sensors. And they have built this pretty ugly skyscraper right behind the castle, and I was too late with taking this picture. So yeah. So what we do, this is just research from my colleagues, and I just want to share that with you just quickly. We do analysis on spatial patterns using geolocated social media data. We bring urban data back into the streets and investigate the social and the social impact, the impact on citizens themselves. This is all in Dutch, so don't bother reading what it says. And we study the role of ludic interfaces in the city as well, as a way of motivating social interaction and play, of course. But back to the core business, media architecture. What is media architecture? In short, it's not a new phenomenon. It's actually rooted in history and definitely in architectural history, since facades have always served more purposes than simply protecting the inside from the outside elements. Think of very beautiful Gothic facades that have something to tell. They tell a cultural story, they tell a social story, a religious story, and they show this to the outside world. Think of mythical, religious and historical stories depicted in stained glass windows. But also think of more contemporary architecture and how material ingenuity, tectonical and technical ingenuity is being shown to the outside world. And in that sense, media architecture is a very logical continuation of the historical interpretation of facades, in the sense that it adds an aesthetical layer by using lights, by using electronics, by using all sorts of kinetic interfaces, as a way to share a story with the neighborhood, about a building owner, about its occupant, in an aim to augment the cityscape with an aesthetic and mesmerizing aesthetical layer or visual layer. Or, and that's I guess the most common example, it is embraced to simply show advertising and use it for its economic or potential economic benefits. So while projects exist in various scales and sizes, and this is just a Google image search, by the way, the thing that always strikes me is that there are no people in all these pictures, so they look very slick and they look very nice, but where are the people? And having said that, that's actually also the basis of my research. So while it is still very much business-driven, very much economy-driven and corporate-driven, I think the voice of the citizens themselves is still missing. So what would people themselves like to see on media architecture? Media architecture encompassing the whole range from media facades like the ones you saw before to the typical public displays, of course. What could benefit people themselves in their daily life? Could we involve them in the design of media architecture? One of the projects that I will show later on is also how can we involve people in designing residential media architecture? Should it always be a skyscraper, or could it also be integrated in your private residence? And how could we empower them in designing, but also in curating and controlling media architecture? So I want to share observations from two recent studies I conducted with you. The first one, what to show, it's actually called Open Window. In this study, I learned from citizens themselves what they would like to see on public displays by simply giving themselves a public display to control and to share messages with their community. So like I said before, I guess you're all aware that this kind of typical public display thing is mostly a black box. It's a well-kept secret in terms of who is controlling the content, or who is even in charge of what interactive possibilities may exist or may not even exist. And citizens are not aware of any channels that usually do exist, but any channels of people to contact when you want something to be published, or it costs a lot of money. And this contrasts, of course, with the term public displays. So while it is meant to address everyone, while it is meant to be a public communication channel, it is in fact not very public. And as a result, on several occasions, and I'm not aware of the situation in Australia, but definitely in Europe, there have been a lot of mismatches between content and the environment where a public display has been deployed in or has been installed in. For example, this one in Brussels, in a highly sensitive neighborhood, it has been vandalized 4 times, and the last time was a few months ago, and still the authorities haven't learned about what is going wrong and what should be improved. But anyway, the people who destroyed are clever enough to actually share why they have destroyed it. And they have destroyed it because of a clear mismatch between advertising for upscale shopping districts nearby in this very sensitive neighborhood, sensitive in terms of social status, societal status, economic status, etc., etc. So this is actually the kinder form of vandalism. They just threw some paint at it, but it has been put on fire before, and things like that. A little bit more friendly, a friendly form of vandalism, and definitely not new in an urban context, is people attaching their own messages to a public display simply because they can't reach the authority or the person or the persons who are in charge of controlling the content. So still a public display meant to address everyone, but out of reach for ordinary citizens, so they simply attach their own messages to the structural support in the hope of reaching a large audience. And actually these major challenges have led us to investigate the potential of citizen-controlled content on public displays in order to further investigate the reciprocal relationship between the display, the content that it shows, and also the environment that the display is situated in. So our very small custom-made system, coined Open Window, consisted of small and self-sustained public displays. When I say small, I think this is very clear. This is a regular 24-inch computer screen. They were housed in plywood boxes. They contained the computer screen, obviously. There was also a webcam on top to record motion in front of the public display. And there was a microcontroller attached to it just to provide wireless communication. In terms of dimensions, I guess this one would be roughly 50 centimeters wide, 60 or 70 centimeters high. And we gave them to 3 households in and around Antwerp, Belgium. And we selected these neighborhoods according to their social status as well. So we had a diverse range of, well, we actually used the income level as a primary, how do you say, parameter to select these neighborhoods. So we had 3 of these. And all participants, being regular households, had access to an online interface to control messages that appeared on these displays, as well as the aesthetics, the looks, the colors, fonts, etc., etc. So before deployment, this is in one of our neighborhoods, the Carrot House. So before deployment, we selected these 3 neighborhoods and chose them because of this rich range of social, demographic, and cultural differences. To give you an overview quickly of the neighborhoods, this is neighborhood A, which is in Belgium characterized as a medium residential neighborhood, so a medium average yearly income. And we gave the display to a family of 4, where only the adults controlled the content on the screen, and the 2 teenage daughters could suggest content, but were not given access to the online interface. I guess that was a clever decision. Well, or not. But anyway, you see the display there in yellow, just tucked away behind the front window and aimed at the street. Neighborhood B is a recent gentrified neighborhood, so a very high income and a low population density. We installed a display in a local coffee shop where the bar owner was in charge of controlling the content on the public display. He did so from within his bar, but also from his private residence a few hundred meters away. And then neighborhood C is completely on the other end of the spectrum, so this is a very sensitive neighborhood in the center of Antwerp. It's a heavily trafficked side street. You can't even see the screen, or hardly see the screen. It's in black behind all the Christmas decorations, as the homeowners really claimed the screen, and they kind of wrapped it in all kinds of Christmas decorations they could find. There is even a Santa Claus on top of the screen. So they really wanted it to be part of their front window. As you can see, it also takes up quite a big part of the front window. So I can imagine that if you have to stare at such a plywood box for a long time, you want to make it look nice. So in this house, this was inhabited by 2 adults and 3 grandchildren, but only 1 adult controlled the content on the screen. After 2 weeks, so 2 weeks after the deployment started, we distributed some flyers, some leaflets among nearby residents, approximately 150 in each neighborhood. In one neighborhood, only 100 because of the high population density. And these flyers simply invited them to participate in an interview with us, which would take a few minutes, in return for a small financial reward. As you can see on the flyers, they could also give a very rough first indication of how they liked and how they perceived the contents on the screen itself, etc. And then finally, after deployment, of course, the respondents were interviewed. The 168 published messages were analyzed, and a representative sample of video clips, which you can see in the back, so 5 days out of the 21 days of deployment, were manually coded to identify key facts, such as people standing still, people interrupting their walk, people starting to discuss the content on the screen, etc., etc. So after concluding the study, we observed that most messages were actually based on events and on narratives that were of a very local nature. So events that really concern the neighborhood itself. And these messages proved to be most memorable by the people living there, by the neighbors, by even the neighbors from other streets, etc. And this particular message was published very early in the morning on one particular day, to kind of notify the potential buyer of the house on the other side of the street to definitely leave the pear tree in the garden, because the children loved to grab all the pears when the time was there. So it was a kind of a gentle notifier for him or her to go ahead, buy the house, but definitely leave the pear tree in our street, because we all love them. But messages were also relevant in terms of time, so in terms of the year, the week, the day. such as warning people about the fact that that temperatures would drop below zero, so please be careful on the road, or put your trash out and don't forget to put your trash out. And obviously these are messages you don't get to see on a public display. On a typical public display in Belgium, for example, gets updated once a week. It's impossible to publish any timely messages. It's even impossible to make it very contextual. Mostly it shows content that addresses a whole city and all residents. In all neighborhoods, so across all 3 neighborhoods, a lot of conversations ensued on the content. And don't get me on this text, on this quote yet. I'll elaborate later. And these conversations, they actually led to a renewed and a constant inspiration for people to keep publishing messages and to keep updating the messages a couple of times a day. And in fact, nearby residents sometimes kind of embraced these messages to trigger new forms of social interaction. In one of our neighborhoods, there was a Facebook group who had died a silent death throughout the years. But one of the neighbors saw it as her responsibility to start copying the messages that appeared on the screen to also distribute it with a wider network, so people living in the side streets, people living around the area, to avoid them to make a detour every day on their way home or on their way to work. And actually this is still sustained today. So through the Facebook group that kind of got a new life back then, they now have talking groups, they do knitting together in the street, etc., which is fun to see. And this particular message, I don't know if anyone is aware of an issue with this message.
It was not in London.
Exactly. So this was published by our coffee bar owner, who obviously wanted to listen to the Beatles, and all of a sudden there was a passerby who did not want to grab a coffee at that point in time, but he saw the message. He made a very clear gesture to the bar owner inside, and he was unaware of what was happening, so he invited him in. They both had a coffee, they had a lengthy conversation, and then like 10 or 15 minutes later there was an update published to the message. Of course, if you only get to see this message, you lose the context. You don't know what the reason or what the motivation was for this message. But still, it's interesting to see that conversations such as these are a follow-up of simple texts on a small public screen. However, despite the positive effect on conversations, we also quickly learned about some challenges and even some annoyances that may exist when you make such a system and make it open to a lot of people, or at least to the households owning the display, but potentially open to a whole community. So at one point when we started doing our interviews with the neighbors, we were confronted with one woman who was, well, quite annoyed actually, that the birthday of her daughter was never mentioned on a public display, while it was mentioned for the woman called Sigrid in this case, but also for a few other local people. And while she was really annoyed by the fact that her daughter's birthday wasn't mentioned, she suggested, like, okay, can't you provide me with some more accessible tools and techniques to suggest content to these families? Of course, you can think of, well, simply ring the doorbell and ask them to publish that message 2 days later. But in a cityscape of today, I guess these social barriers are quite big, and people might need some technological way to bridge the gaps that may exist between your neighbors. Also, we had a failed hacking attempt, but we have no further information about that. We just saw in the logs that someone tried to hack into our system, which would have actually been very interesting to see what could have happened with such a thing. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. That's research, I guess. So over the course of the 21-day deployment, we observed a decrease in the number of published messages. So people started to lose interest in the system. They found it difficult to keep finding inspiration, and then, of course, you can publish a philosophical saying, but you can't do that all day long, or all week long, or all month long. Even though from time to time neighbors still suggested content to them, so they sent a lot of Facebook messages, emails, texts, they even rang doorbells. asking them to publish something when their husband had his birthday and things like that. But still, that wasn't enough for the system to survive. Yet, like I told before, the woman who was annoyed by the birthday not being mentioned, we had several suggestions of people to make a system that would allow shared control of content on a public display. And you can very well imagine that one display in a neighborhood could be controlled by the whole street or even by multiple streets. Displays such as ours, but why not a typical public display? Why can't we deploy public displays in streets and make it open to the street itself or semi-open to the street itself? So whenever our households received suggestions for content, they obviously acted as a moderator, and I think in such a system you will definitely need one or more moderators to make sure that the content is still deemed appropriate and considered appropriate. So in summary, we actually noticed a lot of similarities with typical virtual and online social networks in terms of the message length, in terms of the message contents. But we believe that the success of communication in an urban center or in a city is much more complex, and that's definitely something we learned here. So while a social network such as Facebook, such as Twitter, depends on our personal preferences, we can befriend people who we like, we can befriend celebrities, or we cannot befriend some. It's much more difficult in an urban environment, because there the social network is chosen for us. It's simply the people living nearby. It's simply the people passing by on their way to work or on their way to church or whatever. So in that sense, if you publish a message in such an environment, you have to try and find a balance between the expectations and the norms and the values of all or most people who might be in your area. That's something we very clearly noticed in our very complex environment, let me put it that way, so neighborhood B, where there is a huge language issue, where I believe currently the statistics seem to indicate that 80% of people in that neighborhood don't speak Dutch, which is our main language. So only 20% of people speak our native language. But then again, if in our case we had a household that could only speak Dutch, if you keep publishing Dutch messages or messages in Dutch, you can't address your whole community. So then of course your whole system and your whole concept collapses. So yeah, while messages can really be well meant to evoke some sort of dialogue among people, it's a true challenge that we still haven't been able to solve. So this gave us some initial insights in terms of content, what content should be about, or what content could be about or could not be about. But of course, this was still a very typical rectangular display. And given the examples that I showed before, media architecture is not always rectangular. It's usually the size of your building facade. It's something very organic. And in order to open up that design space, I actually involved citizens and households themselves in the design of some sort of residential media architecture, something that would encompass who they were as a family, what their opinions were on the neighborhood, and translate that in a design for media architecture. So yeah, in many cases, media architecture is still considered a gimmick. I'm not sure if this example is familiar. It's a Dexia Tower in Brussels. It has long time been one of the very first projects that was categorized as being media architecture. It stems from the early 2000s. It's a skyscraper, obviously. But currently it's switched off. And the reason for that is probably very simple. The bank that owned the building, so Dexia, which was one of our national banks, it collapsed with the economic crisis in Belgium and Europe. And they considered it inappropriate for them to, even though they were still the owner of the building, and even though currently they still have offices in there, they considered it inappropriate to show off something beautiful, to use lights, to leave an impression on the city, even though everyone knew that they had collapsed and well, most of the Belgian citizens had to contribute to the effects after these banks failing. So that's of course a very social and societal issue. But by switching it off, it had huge effect on the neighborhood, but also on Brussels on an architectural scale, because this skyscraper was built alongside with the media facade, so it's an essential part of architecture. It would be like putting some wooden boards in front of this window, even though this window is an essential part of architecture. It's part of this building and it signifies this building to some extent. The media facade also had a social role, because again, Belgium seems to be full of complex neighborhoods, but this skyscraper was again in a very complex neighborhood and sensitive neighborhood in Brussels. Yet, through its interactive nature, the project managed to assemble a lot of the youth living nearby and allowing them to play with the lights on the facade every night, every day. So by switching it off, by pulling the plug, of course, this has a huge social effect. It had a spatial role. It was used by a lot of tourists as a light beacon at night, because you could see it from everywhere around Brussels. And also an economic role to a smaller extent, of course, because this project actually gave rise to a lot of small interactive media businesses in and around Brussels. So it's a means still to consider or to show off your corporate wealth. And while this is not necessarily a challenge or something that the field or academia should respond to, I believe it does trigger the question, how could we move beyond and how could we move it to ordinary citizens, and how could media architecture become a situated platform to communicate with your neighborhood through lights? So would such a concept be viable? What are the design implications? What are the participation implications? And how would residents envision such a form of media architecture? And this has led us to investigate the potential of involving citizens in this design process, and thereby rooting the design in its context, in what describes a neighborhood and what makes a neighborhood a neighborhood. So in order to allow us to further investigate this concept, we designed our study along 4 main phases. First, we conducted a series of home visits, 16 in total, with 16 families in and around Antwerp. Again, I guess it's obvious by now that I'm originally from Antwerp, so that's very convenient for me. And we developed a participatory design game for people to brainstorm about their neighborhood and to reveal how they perceive their neighborhood, what their personal position was in the neighborhood, what identified them as families. And we would then translate that into not necessarily realizable, but definitely imaginary concepts for new forms of media architecture attached to their private residence. We ended up with a total of 26 imaginary concepts, on average 2 to 3 concepts per family. And based on these initial results, we selected 3 households to continue development, based on, well, obviously the technical feasibility, which was not really the first parameter, but also the possibilities for architectural integration. We didn't really want to destroy a whole house or a whole facade or make your roof expandable or kinetic and things like that. So these projects and these concepts were deemed infeasible. But the main parameter for selecting concepts was that they should have a different form of output. So we ended up with 3 concepts. One using printed text, similar to our public displays, as output. Another one using light, and another one using audio. I must stress that this design phase was iterative, so even though we ended up with 2 to 3 design concepts per family, this was just the starting ground to initiate the design process. So it was a 2-month cycle of proposing new designs and taking into account their concerns, their recommendations, and then developing final designs. So let me illustrate how the resulting public displays looked, and in the hands of which families they were given. So this is household BS. By the way, they all live in the same street. So household BS is a family of 5, 2 adults, 3 children. And during our participative design session, it was very clear that they were avid music lovers, Also, the house was full of headphones. Later, we learned that the husband had in his basement, he has a collection of 10,000 CDs. So I guess the love for music was pretty obvious. And somehow they kept developing concepts that had something to do with sound. Not necessarily music, but definitely sound. So together with them, we developed a concept, hold on. We developed a device called Listen, which I will show in the next slide. But this is just footage from the national television because somehow they found out about the project. And they were very enthusiastic to start filming in that street. Even though it's in Dutch, I'll try to recap at the end of the movie, since the children will give you an explanation of what the project is about. But just look at how it works.
Okay, that's clown.
Als je de koptelefoon opzet en je drukt op het blij gezichtje, dan krijg je een liedje, een gedichtje of een leuk nieuwsje. En als je op het droge gezichtje drukt, dan krijg je een niet leuk nieuwsje.
So what she said is, if you push the button next to the happy face, you get to hear, well, obviously, happy and joyful messages. If you push the button next to the sad face, obviously you get to hear sad messages, which, well, these kind of messages sometimes pop up in a neighborhood. So this family, the previous family, so Household BS, was given access to an online interface through which they could upload their own recordings live, and they could keep updating the media collection on the headphone set or whatever you want to call it, on Listen, throughout the study period. Our second family, KD, so during Localudo it became very apparent, Localudo is our participative design game, by the way. It became very apparent that they were very much into poetry, very much into literature. The husband also curated or controlled the street's weblog. And building upon that knowledge, they developed more of a tangible system that would be able, or that would, that could actually reach also the older people in the neighborhood, I guess, the people who don't have access to internet, but still want to be kept up to date about very local news. So what they developed is a very simple printer attached to their front door that could simply print out street news and local messages. There we go again.
Goedemorgen. Vandaag is Schermwiet in de straat. Een reportageploeg van dit kinderjournaal komt.
So perhaps even more simple as the previous one, just one button. At the press of a button, a random news item from the last 5 news items is selected and is printed on a thermal printer, so the typical printers you see in a restaurant or in a bar. And people get to have something that they can take home and read later on and share with others. There was even a field that allowed people to respond and to put it back and deposit it back in the mailbox to give them inspiration or to answer to quiz questions or to RSVP to certain events. Our third family, I don't have a picture of them because of privacy reasons, but it's Household BB. In discussions with them, it became very apparent that they were annoyed by street noise. So the daughter slept on the first floor at the front of the house, and apparently their neighbor had a big BMW. I don't have a car, but I guess BMWs make a lot of noise. And she was annoyed, and she was awake at night from time to time. And they wanted to provide an answer to not necessarily that neighborhood, but to street noise in general, without being too offending or without being too, how would you say that in English, without being too reproachful? Could it be? Yeah, okay. So it should actually be a platform for play rather than indicate what annoys these people. So similar to a VU meter that you have on hi-fi equipment, we simply attached the LED strip to the windowsill, added a microphone, and simply visualized ambient noise levels.
Je moet heel hard roepen om die.
I must say that it didn't solve the issue of the street noise.
Als je bij dit huis geluid maakt, dan beginnen de lichtjes te branden. En als het heel luid is het helemaal rood. En als er geen geluid...
So very simple, very straightforward. Just attach it to the windowsill. Also to stress this connotation of this is where the daughter sleeps, so please be silent. The same with the headphone, by the way. It was attached to the mailbox because it provided this connotation of listening into what happened inside the family or with the family. So there were some metaphors. And on this picture, I was very happy to see this. These are city workers who simply tried out all these small displays in the street. And even though that guy who is wearing the headphone couldn't understand Dutch, he still kept listening to the messages, and he tried to translate it to his language and try to make sense of it, which was fun to see. I guess the other two were hard at work taking over his shift, but still, he had a lot of fun. So we deployed them for an 8-week in the wild field study. I must also stress this is very off-the-shelf hardware, Arduinos, so it's not weatherproof. And if you're familiar with the climate in Belgium, it's very rainy. So anyway, they survived for 8 weeks, even though our initial plan was to only deploy them for 3 weeks. But the families themselves, they kept asking to stretch the deployment and keep them longer, which was fun to see. So each family had access to an online interface through which they could control messages or record the audio. They could also see how many button presses there had been, what time of the day was most popular, etc., etc. Except for the family with the LED strip, they could only see statistics. They could obviously not control anything. Everything was pre-programmed. In terms of findings, I'll be very brief about the quantitative results. They are in a bit more detail in the publication, but I must stress that the 40 recordings of listen is because that particular display was plagued with some technical difficulties throughout the whole deployment. But still, we were happy to see more than 5,000 button presses. What we don't have is data on an individual citizen. So we don't know how many times neighbor X has pressed the button, or friend or relative Y has pressed the button. But still, given the context of this street, given the fact that it's an extremely quiet street during the day, I guess you can more or less tell from the charts over there, it's still an impressive number. Rush hour seems to be not only rush hour in traffic, but also rush hour when it comes to public displays. Through the interviews, we learned that the 3 displays made the characteristics of the family visible to the outside world, to the community, which was obviously our aim, to embody some of these characteristics. But it seemed that we were successful and the devices were successful in showing this to the community, as they resembled the family's social status, societal status, and also the architectural context of the house, of course. At the same time, this came with a challenge, as neighbors built upon their knowledge of the family, and they had some initial expectations. Like this quote that we recorded during an interview, when this woman put on the headphone of Listen, she actually expected to hear some very beautiful music, because, as she said before, whenever she walked by the house, she could hear nice and new music play. But then she was very disappointed to hear just a joke, and I guess it was a joke that you could also hear in the video footage. So the hocus pocus thing, which obviously doesn't really have an effect on a middle-aged woman, I guess. So while an obvious solution such as integrating multiple push buttons would come to mind, I guess there is also an opportunity here for more, natural user interfaces, if you want, and more advanced interaction techniques to be integrated to sense the context and to provide content that is, most appropriate for that particular context. In terms of interaction with the neighborhood, we noticed that the displays again were successful in triggering social interaction, and I want to highlight the example of one father who wanted to announce a fundraiser for his terminally ill son, and he didn't want to do that by ringing all the doorbells and selling his waffles, which he did the year before, but he wanted to embrace these displays as an opportunity to address the neighborhood in a less obtrusive way, I guess. So this was day 2 of the deployment. He printed a note on the printer display, so on Riedel, and he wrote a very lengthy reply. It didn't have anything to do with the text that was printed. He just had this idea, I want to use this piece of paper to share my story. And he deposited it in the mailbox of the family that had Listen attached to its house. And even though these 2 people had never met before, they had seen each other in the street, but apart from saying a good morning and a good evening, they didn't really have contact before. Still, the family with the headphone invited him over to make the recording. He did make the recording, and apparently still today they do meet up regularly. And he, as a relatively new neighbor back then, is really welcomed in the neighborhood. So what did he record? He did record his traditional fundraiser, so his idea to sell waffles to the neighborhood without ringing all the doorbells. I don't know in what extent or to what extent he has been more successful than other years, but still this is a very interesting example of how these devices triggered social interaction. So while such an example still is promising, we also need more methods to also involve these people who are less familiar with the neighborhood. I can very well imagine that whenever I walk past such a device with a big red push button and it's the house of my neighbor, I would be very enthusiastic to push the button. But when it's not my neighbor and it's someone living in another city, I might be, well, less eager to push that button. Again, as we heard during one of the interviews. So I didn't really know what to expect. Would it wake the residents? What would happen? Would it be the doorbell? Because indeed the push button had this resemblance of a doorbell. So the challenge is still to include everyone, similar to the observations that we also had or made during Open Window. In terms of content, specifically here we learned about the relevance and the value of what we call hyperlocal content. So content that originates in and from its immediate context and that is of a hyperlocal nature. So while content on a public display in a typical city might be meant to address the whole city, like announcing theater plays, like announcing the next football game, hyperlocal content is really situated on the level of your own street or even part of a street or your own neighborhood. And content is really meant to address only these people. Such as the birthday that we saw in the previous project, so the birthday of neighbors, or any other events that might take place in a street, such as a New Year's drink or a barbecue. We learned from people that they really value this local nature as it makes it a very situated platform and a platform that they can very easily relate to. Again, this comes with a challenge. One day there was a message published about an international flamenco artist who had passed away. It was early last year, I guess. But someone was, well, not really offended, of course, but still she had no relation with that particular message because she didn't know that guy. The same thing happened with national news even being published onto such a platform. People considered it inappropriate because this was a non-political platform. And it should be kept a non-political platform, similar to how public displays work in most cases. But again, this revealed to us that we might need more metrics to evaluate the success of communication. So while an online social network is all about number of likes, retweets, the number of views even, it's not very appropriate for an urban context. So we might need something that measures the awareness a message creates, or even the social engagement it creates, or how far it spreads in the neighborhood and how quickly and how this all disseminates among the neighbors. So finally, in terms of the design perspectives, we learned that these displays opened up completely new approaches and completely new visions onto media architecture, but also exposed the values of urban city life and were successful in triggering social interaction. Also the fact that you had to push a button, you had to wait for your message to be printed or for the audio to be played, it motivated a slower paced atmosphere, which was appreciated by the owners themselves, as you can see in the quote, but was also actually appreciated by the neighbors. And like I said before, this may have led to interest by some local news media, who of course pointed out the fact that these were custom-made systems deployed in a real-world context, but all of them seemed to work out that our intention was to expose the previously underexposed values of city life, where social cohesion seems to be under threat, and we try to provide a creative answer to that. So my takeaway from this talk would actually be to bring awareness to the challenges that come with designing media for public space, in particular on 3 levels. First of all, your environment, so who are you creating digital media for? What are these people's needs? What are their typical daily concerns and daily challenges? The architecture in itself, what is the building, or what is the square, or what is the physical environment, the park, whatever, that your media is going to be deployed in. How does your environment make use of that space? The example of Dexia, for example, the carrier obviously is a bank building, but that comes with a whole social status, that comes with a whole interpretation that people might have. And then ultimately, your content. What will you show on your media architecture or media installation? And how does it relate to your carrier? How does it relate to your environment? What might your environment think of the content, and vice versa? Still, our current research projects have focused on the involvement of single households, but I'm very well aware that if you want to design for a city, you should not focus on one particular household, but try to integrate or involve a larger community, and that's work that is currently ongoing. So we strive for a more long-term involvement, even though I'm quite satisfied with the 8-week deployment. It still doesn't really yield any insights that might, that are highly relevant for long-term deployments. And like I said, this project is currently in a sort of beta phase in Antwerp, where I have designed a large-scale media installation with, again, in a sensitive neighborhood. I don't know why I keep working on sensitive neighborhoods, but anyway, where I have involved a whole community in the design and in the brainstorming of this installation, which would allow them to reclaim this space, which is an inner city park. It's quite historic. It's even heritage listed, but it's underused at night. It's a pretty dangerous spot, and I want to reclaim that space. So again, I involved local residents from various backgrounds, various ethnicities, and we came up with a system that would simply consist of light elements attached between the trees of that particular park that I was talking about, and provide them with interfaces to simply, turn the light on, turn the light off, change the colors, change animations, change the schedules of your lights, all in response to what your needs are at that particular time. To give you an example, there is a basketball court nearby, but again, at night people tend not to use it because it's a pretty dangerous and a rough spot. But still, we can imagine that they start to use these lights as a sort of scoring board or scoreboard, because that scoreboard was stolen a year ago. And at the same time provide light for that particular square. You can also imagine that a couple might try to meet each other underneath the tree, and they could simply text each other, "I'm underneath the red light." Well, that's perhaps not a good example, the red light, but the green light then. So all through an online interface. And again, these are custom-made, self-made systems. 16 of these lamps, 50 RGB LEDs in each lamp, and soon to be deployed. Currently, we have 4 of them running in that neighborhood to let people become familiar with what is going to happen in their neighborhood, but also try out how people interact, what features might be lacking, might be missing. And we came up with a name just a few weeks ago. In fact, actually, the residents themselves came up with the name. Also building upon their ethnicity, we baptized them as the Mukarnas, which is an Arabic architectural element, apparently. Mukarnas. Hold on. It's a sort of a chimney system. If anyone is more familiar with Mukarnas at this moment, no.
Make it up.
Okay, that's good. So it's a sort of chimney system that also provides light to the lower parts. And again, I think this is a pretty literal translation of that concept. They look like chimneys, especially when you would see them hanging between the trees. But I'm happy anyway that they came up with the name. So it's all their project. The idea is also that we will allow children to paint these lamp posts, as I call them. So each of these Mukarnas, so they can really claim it and hope that they don't vandalize and they don't destroy them shortly after. That's all I have to say. I'm very eager to answer any questions.
I have a question about your first study you mentioned, essentially tweeting locally in the streets. I was interested that the displays were very simple, very utilitarian, functional, and they could have written those on a piece of cardboard.
Yeah.
And it reminded me that recently there was a story in the local media here about a sign writer who was actually a sign writer. He didn't use stencils, he was writing the old-fashioned way. And people said they really liked that. It was an individual's fonts and creativity and doing all of that. So I wondered, what's the role of technology? Could you have just said to people, here's some piece of cardboard, write a message? Or was the...
I think that's a very valid point indeed. We didn't really approach that because we wanted to move beyond and wanted to see how a technical communication channel could fulfill their needs and could have an effect on the neighborhood. But indeed, we could have simply provided them with a set of cardboard and asked them to update the cardboard every day. On the other hand, I do think that using technology for that and providing them with an online interface also allow them to, for example, update content from work, which they might not obviously do with cardboard or with traditional means, but it's a very valid point. We actually did consider it as one of the modern counterparts for the typical posters and the typical flyers that people attach to their front side windows, but then the digital counterpart, just text.
I just wonder what you'd see if they were doing it by hand.
Yeah.
So many people would embellish in different ways
Yeah.
than just the message.
Yeah, exactly.
This was a wonderful presentation, wonderful case studies, beautifully designed slides. Great to listen. My question is, for your thesis, is there like a bigger theoretical idea or contribution that you're working on that emerges from and that you illustrate through these case study designs?
The idea is, and that's what I'm working on, especially with the last project, so the project that's currently in a beta phase, that I'll try to theorize and to model all the experience from the previous case studies into a model for some sort of socially responsible media architecture. Is that?
Yeah. I wonder whether you can speak a little bit about some of the ideas that play in, or some of the conceptual or theoretical ideas that may support the model, assuming that you're not starting from scratch, but.
In my personal opinion, it's all about the participative design, and I think that's also what we learned from the 3 alternative public displays, so the second project, the headphones, etc. That as soon as you involve your citizens in your design, I wouldn't say it's a guarantee for success, but it definitely helps your project to move forward and to be accepted by the community. So in that field, that would definitely be a very important theoretical contribution. I mean, all the literature in that domain.
So your contribution will be a method that contributes to participatory design?
No, my contribution, I see my contribution currently as using the techniques from participatory design, and not necessarily my own design game, but also the already existing participatory design techniques as a way to push your media architecture development forward.
Yeah, this is maybe a little bit more of a comment than a question, but I was just kind of thinking like the sort of stuff you're looking at is quite small scale and specific and very localized, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
how do you kind of translate that to something like, a big public urban screen, which tends to be quite static, very expensive, kind of doesn't get updated very often, those kind of issues?
I think you mentioned the word localized in your question. I think for me that it's all around, or it all revolves around the concept of localized. So even though these are small scale, well, let's be honest, low budget projects, still I think the fact that I learned that as soon as it's localized, it builds a platform and people tend to accept it. I think that's also how the large scale projects and the multi-million-dollar projects can be pushed forward and can learn from this. Even a public display such as on Federation Square or in any typical street, I think this yields insights that's also relevant for them.
In terms of the participatory aspect though, the kind of, these are the people in your project have had the opportunity really to design and shape the actual tools or projects that you came up with. Sort of harder to do that with something that's very infrastructural and sort of
Exactly.
like integrated into a physical environment.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely.
Just a comment as well.
Do you know how people in areas like Times Square or West End, I don't know, react to, because there would be local people that live, shop owners that have had to deal with all the big advertising and the screens for a long time.
Well, I don't have any scientific evidence, or I haven't done any interviews with too many local shop owners that live nearby public screens. But from some discussions with shop owners in the city of Leuven, so where I work, who all live next to a public display owned by the local authorities, they do feel a sense of, not belonging there. And there is a tense and a sensitive situation between them, the shop owners, and the public display, because they don't have the means to publish something onto a public screen. And I can imagine that the same happens on Times Square, even though, of course, these are multi-million businesses that might simply buy a large public screen. But still, most of the time, they have no access to a public screen. So I guess there is a tension between the screen and the community that it's deployed in.
Well, we only have time for one more comment or question.
I've already asked the questions.
Yeah, Alice. Do you think that the people in the community embraced your installations more because they were small and low budget? Like if you had given them a big multi-million-dollar screen and said, okay, you guys can do whatever you want, do you think they would be much more hesitant or more organized about it, or take it more formally instead?
There was actually a quote that we got from one of the interviewees who said, I have no connection at all with the typical billboards, simply because of the fact that it's rectangular and it mostly shows text and perhaps an image. But it's all a very traditional and a very well-known technique, a screen. Whereas, as he said, these displays provide an alternative means of communication, something tangible in the case of the printer, or something very quick and temporal, such as the audio. But indeed, to really have scientific proof of that, we would need to do that. And that's actually also how this project, so with the printer, started. Like, couldn't we just hire a public screen, a small public screen, put it in a residential street and give people access to its content? But as I said, this is a low budget project, and even renting a big billboard is pretty expensive. I guess someone who was involved in encounters does know that.